He's taught at Columbia and NYU and lives with his wife and daughters in Westchester County, New York. Please welcome Kostya Kennedy.
Michael, it's good to see you.
Well, it's great to see you, and sorry about we had some technicals there, but I think we got that behind us. True, The Four Seasons of Jackie Robinson is a wonderful book, but don't take my word for it. Take Ken Burns, who wrote the PBS series in baseball. Ken Burns said, "This is a marvelous addition to the library on the ever important, ever enigmatic Jackie Robinson, one of the towering figures in the civil rights movement. Kennedy has given us 4 remarkable snapshots of Jackie at his most brave and vulnerable moment." So when you got Ken Burns saying stuff like that, how does it make you feel about your book? It's pretty amazing.
Well, it's wonderful. It's very humbling, and I'm grateful that that anyone feels strongly about it. And certainly, he's the person whose work I and many other people greatly admire. So I was very pleased that he read the book and found such kind things to say about it.
Mm-hmm. So let's go way back to before when you were a kid. Who was your team?
Well, my team was the Mets. I grew up in Long Island, New York, and it wasn't that separated from Jackie Robinson, who my mother had grown up in Queens. They were immigrants they'd come to Europe at the time of the Nazis taking over Austria. Her parents had fled Austria and come to Queens, and they grew up there. And they certainly weren't baseball fans by any stretch. They were Viennese and from Prague. But as my mom told me when I was just a little boy, I was going to my first game ever, and I loved baseball, but didn't know what team I liked. And she said to me, when I was growing up, the Dodgers had a player named Jackie Robinson, and none of the other teams let black players play. So we all became Dodger fans. And then the Dodgers moved to California, and the Mets came to take their place. So we're Mets fans. And I would bequeath that and have led a life of probably overinvestment in the Mets ever since.
So there's no way in heck that your mother was going to let you be a Yankees fan then.
Not from there, and they were in Queens, so it wasn't quite like being from Brooklyn. There are a few Yankee fans from Brooklyn, but not many. If you grew up in that era, the Dodgers were your team, and more likely than not, Jackie Robinson or maybe Pee Wee Reese or one of the others was your player.
Mm-hmm. Before we go into the book, though, who was your player?
I don't know that I have I love Tom Seaver, a little before my time, but what a great player. Mookie Wilson, some of the great Mets.
All right. So getting to the book now, what inspired you or made you want to write this book?
Well, I've been intrigued and thought about Robinson for quite some time throughout my career, covering baseball, working at Sports Illustrated. I read a lot about him. I did some reviews, ended up, writing our review on 42. And I also did, some years ago, about 8 years ago, I did a fairly long piece in Sports Illustrated on Rachel Robinson, Jackie's widow, who will be turning 100 in July.
Wow.
And that really, that drew me to him in a new way and made me see that there was more to the story or other to the story to be told. And I've been, Michael, gathering string on this for some time as a writer and thinking about it. So it's been sort of shimmering or hovering around me for a little bit.
You, like me, haven't and never had the pleasure of seeing Jackie Robinson, but we identify ourselves with him so much. And I'm wondering why that is in your eyes.
Well, I think that, even now, and we're coming on, as I think you alluded to, the 75 years since the day when he came into the National League, integrated baseball. And that, quite simply, is baseball's finest hour. all this time later, and an incredibly significant moment in this nation in the 20th century, not just in baseball. But I think that the power of that, the ability to use sports as something else, as something greater than the games, is pretty rare. It can certainly transcend in a moment, but to have something that sort of shift society or touch people far outside the sport, there are certainly other examples, of course, but there aren't that many. And Jackie is probably the singular example of that, certainly in baseball.
The power he had, and I didn't get this firsthand of how far he reached until I went to a Jackie Robinson Day at Dodger Stadium, and I covered it. And there's one picture I'm going to share with you that just sticks with me. Was this photo here? Here I am, this local podunk reporter, and I'm standing here in front of baseball royalty. On the left, you have Frank Robinson and Hank Aaron, Bud Selig. We'll throw him in there because he's in the Hall of Fame. But then we have Rachel Robinson, who carried herself with such regalness, and she was like royalty. And you should see all those big, strong baseball men just fawning over her. It was just quite a sight to see.
They've often refer to Rachel as the Queen Mother. Joe Morgan used to, before he passed away, used to call her that a lot. And England has its queen, and we have our Queen Mother. That was Rachel. Listen, it's often said that a man or a woman might not have achieved what they achieved without the benefit of their partner and their spouse, and it's often true. It's really more true than it is in this case. Rachel was there in the very beginning when they started out in 1946 playing in Montreal, and she lived 50 years without him, and she has been incredibly intelligent and accomplished woman in her own right, a nurse and a medical professional and administrator, and also the caretaker of the Jackie Robinson Foundation now. And during Jackie's journey, she was right there, and it's no exaggeration to say he would not have succeeded as he did without her.
Was there anything that you learned in your research that surprised you about Rachel? I should ask.
I think her steadiness, her patience, understanding just how integral she was. What I just said here, the way Jackie would often refer to himself as we, because he became so habituated to relying on her. So towards the end of his life, Jackie had a lot of physical challenges and health issues. And he would say, well, we're going to we're having a surgery, we're having x-rays. The most personal thing no one could say, obviously it was only he who was having it. And that intertwinement was probably even more than I had realized.
I found what you wrote about them together is very touching, especially in the later part of the book. I think it just really,
She also
unpeeled some.
Sorry, Michael. I was just going to say she also had a certain strength to her that came through, and was sort of determined very early on to sort of walk straight. She didn't want to stoop as she got older, and she made a conscious effort to walk straight. And there's another example where she was offered a position on the board at Yale Medical Center, and she said, "Well, I'm not unless you hire another African American or another woman. You're not going to get a twofer from me." And she was pretty clear on about her standards and her beliefs, and very impressive in that way.
Wow. So about the book is, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of books about Jackie Robinson, but yours was unique in that you divided it into seasons, which are representative of periods of his life. You have spring and his early years in Montreal, then you have summer during the middle part of his career, then toward the end of his career is fall, and then later on you have winter. And it's like, how did you decide to divide it this way? I mean, it's perfect, but I was just wondering what your thought process was.
No, it's a good question. It kind of came to me as a way to want to look at Jackie closely, but not overly laboriously. So to be able to have a clear window into him in a discrete period of time. I admit I was inspired in some ways of a series of films by Michael Apted called the Up series that maybe
Oh yeah, 7 Up,
14 Up, right?
yeah.
Where you drop in on the same cohort of people every 7 years. And in that view, a lot is told without necessarily having to go recount what happened each year in the 7 years in between. And that was somewhat of a model here, something I thought about. And I felt that as you point out, they are metaphorically, these actual years are metaphorically the seasons of his life, of his public and athletic life. And it seemed extremely fitting because he was so young and green, as it were, that first season in Montreal. And in 1949, the summer year is truly in the flush of life and just blooming and as on top of his milieu and on top of his environment that he could be. And then to see him in the later years, so, with incredible dignity and incredible insistence of a kind, even as he got into the last year of his career, which I talk about, and then the last year of his life, 1972, a very important year for many reasons, long before his death at the end of that year.
So we get to spring and his days at Montreal. How were you able to find? I mean, with major league things, you can have a lot of research at your disposal, but when you get to the minor leagues and the Negro Leagues, it's very difficult. So how are you able to research that part of your story?
Yeah, there's a little bit of record keeping, but a lot of that is available. But a lot I depended on newspapers, both French language and English language. I had help with the translation. I don't speak French.
Okay.
There was a lot of coverage in those days. There were a lot more newspapers, not only, of course, in Montreal where he played, but throughout Canada. And then most of the games were played against teams in the United States, in Buffalo, Syracuse, Jersey City, Baltimore, and so on. And those newspapers covered him quite extensively. I had also had the benefit of spending a fair amount of time with Rachel earlier on, talking about that year. And I did perhaps the most interesting thing was to reach out to people who remembered seeing him then. There was a woman named Mitzi Melnick, who had very clear recollection. People in the African American community, a man named Ivan Livingstone, another man named Glenn Gunning, who really, they could remember that time. And it was 1946 was, of course, right after the war, and it was an extremely ripe time if you were a young person, especially if you happened to love baseball and go see Jackie, but just to be in Montreal, it was a very vibrant time. And so you kind of, Michael, you piece it together. You get information where you can, and I did a lot of sort of puzzle piece hunting and then trying to fit it together.
So you were able to talk to Rachel then about a lot of things. Yeah. How much were you?
Most of my talks with Rachel were before beginning this book proper, and when I was doing the feature on her, and then over the years that followed, there were several more interactions with her. So yes, in those times I spoke to her quite extensively, actually.
So you had the blessing of the Robinson family, and that I'm sure that was a plus.
Yes.
I kind of wondered about the tone of that section, because there's this Japanese word called natsukashi, which means nostalgic. There's not a word that really reflects upon it like in English, but you say it in a way of like whimsy or natsukashi, you like you long for that tone. And that's what I felt when I was reading this part of the book. And now I get it, because you're talking to Rachel about it. I'm sure she spoke fondly because it was a wonderful time in their life where
Yes.
people, yeah, go ahead.
No, it's a great point, Michael. It's a wonderful time and an extremely important time to have them. It was sort of their first exposure and Robinson's first exposure to really being at the center of all that attention. He'd been a football star in college, and so it wasn't completely unknown for him to be a known figure. But to be going into baseball stadiums where he was the guy that people were coming to watch, or they were coming to watch the game, but they were very aware of him. He was the only black player in an all-white league. Big crowds, a lot of pressure on him, and then being welcomed into the neighborhood, being a sort of celebrity around his own home, and all of those things were really important for to prepare Robinson and Rachel psychologically, emotionally, and in Robinson's case, physically for 1947, the year he broke in, and the many years that followed. So, yeah, it was a year that both of them held quite dear and regarded as extremely important.
Oh, interesting. And it also exposed them to a different life. And it sounded like a very appealing life for them, as opposed to later years when they had to deal like with playing ball in the South. And if you could talk a little bit about those early times of him having to adjust playing in Florida and the South there after coming from Montreal, I'm sure it's quite an adjustment for Jackie because he came from California and then he went to Montreal and now he had to play in the South.
Yeah, so he'd had little taste of it, and growing up in Pasadena, there of course wasn't the segregation of the American South, but he remembered, being only allowed to swim at the swimming pool one day a week, because that's when the Black community was allowed to swim there, and so he certainly had a sense of and had felt the hardship of segregation and prejudice growing up, but not to the degree of the divide within the American South. And one telling time was during that year in Montreal, they made it to what was called a Little World Series, which was essentially the minor league World Series, and they played the team from Louisville. And they went down that October to play in Louisville. First, they played a few games there, and then they came up and played the others in Montreal. And it was in Louisville. They received incredibly difficult treatment. There were Jim Crow stands, segregated stands, and the home crowd was absolutely vicious toward Robinson, who, by the way, was often the target of pitchers trying to hit him as well. So it wasn't just verbal abuse, which is horrible enough, but also physical. And it affected Robinson. He didn't play well at all in those few games. And he admitted that he was rattled. He was unsure in the field. He had a lot of those feelings that one can imagine and expect. And then when he came back to Montreal, the crowd really got behind him. And they started, in Montreal, they didn't boo people, but they booed the Louisville team because they had heard what happened to Jackie down in Louisville. And that emboldened him, and they ended up winning that World Series. So his time in the South then was most prevalent during spring training when the Dodgers would play down in Daytona Beach and then later in Vero Beach. And it was always hard right through the end of his career. The situation didn't change that much, incremental progress. But between 1946 and 1956, he was still going down to segregated places, often segregated by law or culturally segregated. So it was difficult. He heard everything you could hear, but he did have a supportive group of teammates, and of course had Rachel, and that's kind of what got him through. And he succeeded under that pressure in a way that not a lot of people could have. Others had, of course, experienced that and succeeded, but it was a special kind of pressure on Jackie.
Wow. Not only the law enforcement issue that was, but there's also the view of his own teammates. And while some were against him, some outwardly spoke up for him, inevitably they would always have to go to separate hotels. They would drop off, Jackie Robinson, Don Newcomb, Roy Campanella, later on Joe Black, and they would send them to an all-black hotel while, the teammates would sit, but they wouldn't say anything. And I think what you wrote really spoke volumes, because I'm sure that was a difficult time, man. It's difficult enough to deal with the prejudice, outward prejudice, but then having to deal with that, I'm sure was kind of disheartening for him.
Yeah, it was very powerful to come across that. It was a time that made a big impression on Jackie and on Don Newcomb, as you mentioned. Specifically, what you're talking about is when they would go to St. Louis in the major leagues, and so you're traveling in kind of a major league style. You're flying on probably a chartered plane, certainly in a first class environment with your team, and then you're taking a bus, but a good luxury type bus of whatever exactly that meant in 1949. Yeah. And then you're coming to a hotel in a certain part of town, and the black players the door opened and the black players get out and go to their hotel, and in a lower income neighborhood, and the rest of the team goes off and stays in the Chase Hotel in St. Louis. And it really stayed with them that even the players who were supportive of Jackie and didn't, were not discriminatory outwardly on the field, just kind of, as you describe it, as I put in my book, they stayed there and watched them get off, and that was it, and you can sort of imagine those players standing outside the bus and what that did. Jackie went on to integrate the Chase Hotel at St. Louis. He continued to put pressure on the hotel to let them come, and they finally did. And when they did, there was still sort of stipulation. They were saying, "Well, listen, we don't want you eating in the restaurant. We don't want you down in the lobby, but you can come stay here." And Newcomb said, "Well, I'm not doing that. If they're going to be that way, then I'm going to still stay at the Adams or whatever the hotel is he was staying at the time." But Jackie took it. Jackie said, "All right, I'm coming." And gradually he would go down to the lobby, and he would go to dinner when he wanted to. And he worked his way. Jackie felt that he was there as an agent of progress, and getting into the door was better than not. And he worked. One really interesting thing about Jackie is he was an absolute disruptor because of what he did, but he disrupted within the confines of the system. He wasn't really a rule breaker. He didn't push outside the system. He was just insistent within it to take everything that he should have and that obviously deserved. And it went a long way, and within a couple of years, all black players were staying at the Chase Hotel, and Jackie's decision had a lot to do with that.
You had mentioned earlier, you'd mentioned St. Louis, and I have to share a story from a reporter named Lester Rodney. I'm not sure if you've heard of him, but he was the sports editor of the Daily Worker, the communist paper, and they were the first white paper to decry the segregation in baseball. And he had told the story of how this African-American St. Louis resident was cheering for the Dodgers, and his buddy next to him, white guy, just goes, "Hey, how come you're rooting against the home team?" And then he shows his arm and goes, "Well, once they get one of these, I'll happily root for the St. Louis." But everywhere Jackie went, he attracted also the crowd of black crowds and more enlightened folks as well. So he started getting a following throughout the whole National League and in New York when they played the Yankees in the World Series, didn't he?
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Michael. And there's no question about that. They would, if they play, say, in a place such as Cincinnati, which is very close to the South, people would come up by bus. They take the bus from New Orleans to come up for a couple of days and see, meaning they travel a couple of days by bus to come up and see Jackie. His allure and his presence and what he meant to the African American community can't be overstated. And they would go, they put on, the black community in Florida would go and wear their best Sunday clothes, as many people did in those days, dress for baseball, and go and see overflow to see Robinson. At one point, Jackie was saying, I think this was in Georgia or maybe in Beaumont, Texas, but the crowd was so large. And he said, look, there were people literally would climb the trees outside to watch. And Robinson said, listen, they just want to say they were here. They want to feel that they were here. They're not even necessarily have to pay attention to every pitch of the game, but they want that feeling of being part of something. And it was clear that they were part of something incredibly special and nation changing. It was extremely resonant for that community and for outside the community as well.
I think if I were a young person or even an older person, I'd want to do the same thing, is just show up and be a part of it, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. I mean, you can imagine, it's sort of, when you think if you go now to Ebbets Field, right? So, which was in Brooklyn, of course, there was no segregation there, no codified segregation. There may have been sort of but there was self-segregation. People tended to live the Italians lived in one neighborhood and the Irish lived in another. And black people and white people didn't really live side by side, even then in Brooklyn. But when you went to Ebbets Field, a white family might be right next to a black family, and you're all cheering together with a common purpose. And a real passion. And in this case, you're both cheering for Jackie Robinson. You're also both cheering for Duke Snyder or Pee Wee Reese. You're not cheering for your team, your guys. And maybe you embrace or you cheer together or look at each other. And that kind of community, which played out at various stadiums, it just simply wasn't where else but Ebbets Field. And maybe somebody can think of a place, I don't mean it rhetorically, I mean it literally, where else but Ebbets Field was this happening on this scale and on such a platform to have such an integrated venue like that. It's really a special occurrence.
So a listener wanted to know that in his first few years, Jackie couldn't fight back. Yet as his career went on, he was able to do so. And if you could talk a little bit about that, his transition from turning the other cheek, as he had said, to being able to be this really tough instigator, so to speak.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And when he came into the National League in 1947, he had agreed with Branch Rickey, the Dodgers general manager, that he was going to not fight back, that he would sort of take the abuse. And it wasn't just because Rickey decided this. Robinson, very much a free thinker, believed and felt that this was the right way to go about it. One thing I just want to mention as an aside, we've talked about the pressure that he felt from racist treatment and from mistreatment. There's also a lot of pressure just from people who loved him and wanted him to succeed. He had sort of, the African-American newspapers are right, he represents all of us. His success is our success. Well, that's a lot. That's a lot to hold on, even in a positive sense. Yeah. So he felt the best thing to do was to not retaliate. And in 1947 and 1948, nobody in baseball was hit with a pitch more often than Jackie Robinson. And we know that was not by accident. And he would get hit by a pitch and he'd get back up and jog down to first base. Before the 1949 season, he decided that's going to change. And I think the big part was that he was now established. People knew he could play. Like on the ground, in the weeds, people knew he could play. He was a really, really good player. Which gave him, in an athletic environment, a level of comfort and a level of respect. And he said before the 1949 season, which is the figurative summer that I write about, they better be rough on me this year because I'm going to be rough on them. He said that in spring training. And out came Jackie and was, you said the word instigator, he was certainly a heightened version of himself. Now he was not only this active base runner, he would call out and try to rattle a pitcher verbally. He slid hard into bases. He did not shy away from a collision. He was a disruptive force on the base path. He made pitchers uncomfortable, defense uncomfortable. And what happened? Jackie Robinson that year was the best baseball player alive. He won the Most Valuable Player award, led the league in hitting. It transformed his game. It took him from being a very good player to being one of the all-time greats. And it was that change that enabled him to be the athletic presence that he became.
Wow. And that was the start of where he earned the honor of having the MVP award named after him.
Yeah.
I think that was the year.
Yep.
If you could talk a little bit about his play, I mean, his play, I'll just share this photo here of him stealing home. And what he had done with making pitchers look bad or making them into bad, that's what struck me the most about him. If you can expand a little bit about what he had done, his aggressiveness, his ability, his brains all together coupled into this amazing force of baseball.
Yeah, well, so Jackie was he was a star player in many ways. He could hit. He a plus defender, but nothing was more elevated in his game than his ability to run the bases, to steal bases, but also just to unnerve other teams on the base path. He early on and throughout his career would draw comparisons to Ty Cobb, who it was about a quarter century since he'd played. So it tells you how long it had been since there had been such a disruptive player. And it defined him. And it's not an accident that the first African-American player had these characteristics. When Branch Rickey was looking for a player to try to give this opportunity to, he was very aware of Jackie's style. And people have talked about, and quite rightly, Michael is wearing a Josh Gibson jersey tonight, that Josh Gibson was a very talented Negro Leagues player who didn't get a chance to play in the major leagues, was clearly talented enough to play in the major leagues and would very likely have thrived there, with a different kind of player. When a home run hitter can be very exciting, of course. A guy who is out there and running, and who, as soon as he's on the bases or as soon as he comes into the batter's box, sometimes he would hit the ball and it looked like he was hitting it on a dead sprint already, the way he was on his way to first base. and he was the guy you wanted to watch. You couldn't take your eyes off him. And that was a really big thing. And he ran a lot. He got caught stealing too, and that was part of the process and part of the idea. So that style is what carried him. He's always said that daring was a big part of my success, and it's a big part of why he was so dominant as a player during his peak years.
People love Gehrig and Ruth and everything, but give me a Jackie Robinson or a cool Papa Bell anytime. To see players like that move is it's poetry in motion, is what I think it is. So your next section, we're only on the second section, but is the last year of his competitive career. And it was just the year after that they won the 55 World Series, 1956. Jackie didn't play a lot during this year, so it was a tough struggle for him.
It was a tough struggle, although actually in 55 was an even harder year. It's remembered as a glorious year, and it was because for the Dodgers, who won the World Series that year, the one time they beat the Yankees while they were in Brooklyn. So it's a triumphant year, but for Jackie, it was really a tough year. And 56, the year 1956 came around, the Dodgers brought in a young third baseman. Jackie was playing third in those days. He'd moved over from second 2 years before. And there was a lot of thought, could Jackie continue? Could he be successful? And he actually turned himself around, not to the level of the peak performance we were talking about earlier, but to have quite a productive and important, well above average, near all-star caliber year. And it was what's important about that is this sort of show of will. He was not going to go gently. He was not going to slink away from the game. He went out as a productive, excellent player. And that was important. And there were moments in the year, in the big games towards the end of the year against the Braves, who were their chief competition that year, when Jackie really came through, won games for them, and knew that the end was near. He knew that he was going to soon be retiring. And sure enough, he did right after that season. And I think interesting thing about Jackie, I don't think he looked back and had any regrets about retiring. A lot of times ball players miss the game so much. Jackie never expressed that. His body hurt in many ways, and he was ready for rest. And I think his time had come when he said goodbye.
Am I remembering it correctly that you wrote that he didn't play in the final game of the '55 World Series?
Yeah, he didn't play in '55 in Game 7 of the 1955 World Series. Jackie was on the bench. It's the only World Series game he didn't play in that the Dodgers won throughout his 10-year career.
That's the first I've ever read that. That's just so shocking to me, because much has been made of the wait till next year. This year was the finally here, and then to hear that his greatest player didn't play in the ultimate game of their crowning achievement.
Yeah, it was actually a source of further friction between Robinson and the Dodgers manager at that time, Walt Alston, who chose not to play him and played Don Hoke, who was a perfectly okay player, but that's what he was, an okay player, over Jackie. And Jackie, who had no love for Alston even before that, never quite forgave him.
Well, I don't think a lot of Dodgers players had a lot of love for what they call him, Silent Walt, or what do they call him?
Okay. The silent man. The silent man.
Yeah, that's not a flattering term.
No, but to his credit, I mean, he did preside over that World Series, and he was there for some good years. But it's true, he certainly had his detractors.
To his credit, he won 4, didn't he not?
Yes, he won one, and then he won the other 3 in Los Angeles. Absolutely.
Los Angeles.
Yep.
So during this period, there's this one photo I showed briefly earlier, and it is an extremely sad photo. It's displayed at the clubhouse level at Dodger Stadium. For anybody who's ever been to Dodger Stadium and hasn't seen the club level, you have to see it. It's a mini museum. It's not only the statues out in front of the Robinson, the soon-to-arrive Sandy Koufax statue, but it has a lot of great artifacts. But this is probably one of the saddest photos I've ever seen. I think it was right after he found out he was going to be traded to the Giants. I'm not quite sure. But
yeah, I'm not sure, Michael. If you ask that, I have seen this picture before, but I don't know the history or context of this actual picture. When he was traded to the Giants was after the season. He had already internally made up his mind to retire and had already taken his job at Chock full of nuts. So he knew he was never going to go play for the Giants. But nonetheless, he found that to be a show of disrespect, and he was certainly bothered to have had that trade happen.
So that's the one thing I had a bone to pick with you about. You dispelled that myth about him refusing to be traded to the Giants, because that's the myth that we all grew up with as kids. It's like, it's Jackie saying, I'm not going to play for the Giants. But he had, in your book, again, for the first time, read that he had already decided to retire and transition to his life after baseball. And he had a pretty good life after baseball, didn't he?
Oh, he really did, and I think overall his life, we talk about the hardship, but and Rachel has said, while it was difficult in some ways, that he also knew how lucky he was and how fortunate they were to have the opportunity that they got, and they made the most out of it. But they felt like they lived a life where they felt that they had earned what they got. They weren't necessarily given anything, but they were presented with an opportunity that they then took the most of. Yeah, he had a very active life politically. I mean, he, as I mentioned, he had a job at Chock full of Nuts in the business world. He went on to help found a Black-owned bank in Harlem, started a low-income housing construction company, and was also very active as a columnist. He wrote a column for the New York Post. He wrote a syndicated column, and he worked heavily in civil rights, very close with Dr. King, who, you know, during the Dream speech, Jackie was there with all of his, with his family right up on the dais for the Dream speech. He worked to repair some burned churches in Georgia with Dr. King. He worked for the NAACP. He was very active and did have a good life. It was really all about building bridges for Jackie. That was his concentration.
He really did that. And what my favorite part of that section is about is hosting like Dave Brubeck and Dizzy Gillespie at his house. I mean, he had these wonderful jazz concerts. And
yes, they had a home in Stamford, Connecticut, where they lived throughout Jackie's retirement. They moved there while he was still playing, with a beautiful backyard. And they had they called them afternoons of jazz, which raised money for the civil rights movement. Sometimes they went to free, you know, peaceful protesters who'd been jailed. It was for bail money for there. It went for a different cause within the civil rights structure each time. MP Ralph Abernathy came, and Adam Clayton Powell came, and Jesse Jackson came, and one year Dr. King was there. Everybody was aware of how important it was. And yes, they got the great Ella Fitzgerald. I went in this backyard. The house is still there. Of course, the Robinsons are no longer there, but the house is. And you know, the stories of the neighbors in their shower, and then suddenly they think it sounds like Ella Fitzgerald is singing, and they look out the window and there's Ella Fitzgerald in the backyard. So yes, an incredible thing that they did that really again had an impact. Raised actual funds that went to real work, and really important work.
And what I also really loved about this section is you talked about, through Jackie's eyes, that the movement of the Black people wasn't always a united front. You had Dr. King, Martin Luther King, and then you also had Malcolm X, who actually clashed with Jackie or disagreed with, I should say. And Jackie, of course, wasn't afraid to speak his mind. He was a very interesting he had very interesting political views. I mean, he supported Nixon over Kennedy, but he also wanted to further the cause of the Black people. So I found him very enigmatic in this sense.
Yeah, you know, he and the title of my book, the big title is "True: The Four Seasons of Jackie Robinson," and that alludes to a few things. You know, meaning that he was true to his mission that he had, and he was true to his conviction. He was also true to his own contradictions, meaning that he didn't necessarily have a checklist of things. Okay, you're a Democrat, you check these off. You're a Republican, you check these off. He would go across the aisle in that sense. When he supported Nixon over Kennedy, it wasn't necessarily that he thought that Nixon overall had a better policy or anything. He couldn't take it that the Dixiecrats of the South, men like George Wallace and Bull Connor, had such a hold on the Democratic Party. John F. Kennedy would have lunch with George Wallace. He needed Alabama, he felt, for to win the election. And so Jackie was a very sort of principled stand when Goldwater came into the Republican Party. Jackie wasn't having any of that. So he knew what he was thinking about. He did, as you said, he wasn't afraid to. He was always polite and respectful. But he was not afraid to disagree, and he did clash with Malcolm X in print publicly. Adam Clayton Powell, even with Dr. King, with whom he was deeply aligned. Jackie, and this is another surprise, perhaps, he was supportive of the Vietnam War. Jackie was, even though he had faced prejudice. He himself, Robinson, had faced prejudice in the Army. Even though his son Jackie Jr. had a really difficult time in the Army, he still believed in U.S. government, believed he was against communism, and he had sort of a break with King over that issue. Overall, they were very much aligned and had an extremely strong relationship. But Jackie was not afraid to disagree if he felt. Doesn't mean he was always right or always wrong. Who is? But he was honest to his own beliefs.
He disagree with Dr. King about Muhammad Ali.
Yeah, and again, it relates to the Vietnam issue, but absolutely, Robinson continued to call him Cassius Clay. Even after he changed to Muhammad Ali, he one thing he didn't accept, which, Jackie was as you say, a little bit enigmatic or just a little bit multi-layered in his what he had. Yeah,
multi-layered, I think it's more accurate term, because after all, he did support Humphrey over Kennedy prior to.
Yeah, I mean, you see that there is there's one issue above all others for Jackie, and that was civil rights for African Americans, rights for anyone who was, and he was always very clear about talking about this, for anyone who's discriminated against. It's immigrants. He would say, it's not easy if your skin is a different color or if you have a name people can't pronounce. It's not easy, right? He wanted to advance people who needed a voice, and so you can see that in the way in who he supported and how he supported people.
And he didn't take it personal, because I remember I was reading in your book that after Malcolm X was assassinated, he wrote some very nice things about Malcolm X as a person, that he didn't agree with him, but he thought of his leadership. There were some positives out of Malcolm X. So
he didn't believe in X's sort of violence aspect of that movement, but he understood they were on the same sort of team. And looking for the same goal in a larger sense at the end. And he wrote very eloquently after the assassination and mournfully. He was very, of course, extremely sorry to see that death.
So he had to live through a lot with Malcolm's assassination and then Martin Luther King. It was a difficult time. It's funny that he disagreed with everybody, just like he played, with the exception of Branch Rickey, I would think, because I think you wrote that. But it had a civility that is absent in politics today, I think. He explained himself clearly, and this is why I disagree with you. And this is something that we all can learn in politics, is to be able to have this disagreement with somebody on the other side of the spectrum while explaining yourself and being respectful at the same time. And that's something that I didn't know about until I read your book. And I appreciate that you brought this up.
Oh, good. Yeah. I mean, it was very much his MO, and he would write letters to people. And, Jackie Robinson is extremely well known and had access. For instance, one example of what you're talking about a little bit is President Eisenhower, with whom he appreciated, of course, that Eisenhower had sent troops in to help desegregate. But at one speech that Jackie was at, or the sort of smallish speech, Eisenhower was basically saying to the African American community, "We're working on it. Just be patient. We're working." And Jackie went home and sort of fired off a letter, very respectful. "Dear Mr. President, I so appreciate this." And he said, "But when you say to be patient, we have been patient too long. What are we waiting for?" He really disagreed, and he wasn't afraid to say it. And that was an important characteristic of Jackie. And it's interesting because it's consistent with the athlete. The human being, it's consistent with the way the athlete played.
We have a question from a reader, which gives a good segue to the final section. It's like, there not much is heard about Jackie's failed health. What happened? Well, read the book first, but
no. I'm happy. Look, so he died at age 53. and looked much older. And at the time of death, his eyesight was failing. He had circulation issues and various things. Diabetes was the main culprit, and he suffered badly from it for many years. He didn't drink alcohol. He didn't smoke, but he did like his sweets, which is no great sin, but it wasn't a wonderful thing for his diabetes, that's for sure. And Rachel was always trying to get him to eat less sweets. And yeah, one reason why it's not talked about as much is because even in his failing condition, Jackie stayed incredibly active. And so the last year of his life, 1972, was a year when he sort of got repatriated into baseball. He hadn't been involved in baseball for about 15 years, basically since his retirement. And he came back and got involved in the game. He traveled and did events. Just 9 days before his death was when he was famously on the field before Game 2 of the World Series, and in characteristic style, thanking baseball for the opportunity, and then saying, "And don't forget, you've got to hire a black manager." They still had not integrated the managerial ranks at that point. And that's 9 days before he died. And when he did die, the people really close to him who saw him were, of course, shocked and heartbroken. But it wasn't entirely unexpected because they'd seen his health. But for those who were not so close to him, it was an absolute shock. Here, what do you mean? He's 53. I just saw him on TV. What do you mean? And so that's partly why I think not as much is known or said about his health in those years.
There were some sad moments that you mentioned, including Bill Hodges' funeral, where he had trouble getting out of his car and needed assistance from one of his old teammates. And the other one was when a fan threw him a ball and wanted an autograph, it hit him because he couldn't see the ball.
Yeah. Jackie Hamlet was such grace. He was at Dodger Stadium, and somebody called out, "Hey, Jackie," and sort of tossed him a ball, and it just hit him sort of on the top of the shoulder, against the cheek maybe. And immediately all the people who were around Jackie were rushed to see if he was okay, of course, and then started saying, "Get that guy out of here." And Jackie kind of put up his hand and was like, "Hey, can somebody give me the baseball?" And somebody got him the ball, and he signed his name and said, "Please give this back to the gentleman," and just sort of diffused the situation, which was also a pretty classic thing for Jackie to do. But yeah, he was failing, and when people would see him at Campanella, who of course by that point was in a wheelchair from having his own car accident many years before, but he hadn't seen Jackie in a long time and saw him in 72, and a week later wept about it, and it was such a shock to people to see how the physical toll that diabetes and his other complications from diabetes had taken.
So somebody on YouTube wanted to know, I'm looking forward to reading the book. Is there any person, not just in sports, but in history, who you can compare Jackie Robinson to?
It's an excellent question. I'm afraid to get the analogy wrong. I do think that probably the characteristics that he had are consistent with people of a certain conviction. But I don't know that I've encountered somebody that it comes immediately to mind. So I'll have to think about that. If there's a way to get back to this questioner at some point, I'd be happy to do that. But I don't have someone off the top of my head to say.
Well, send me an email at events@chaucersbooks.com, and then I will hit Kostya for that question. We just have a one more time for one more thought, and that's for you, Kostya. What was the experience like researching and writing this book?
Well, it was a deeply engrossing and engaging experience, as doing such a book is, and it was the thing you learn so much just about, I guess, human nature, about oneself, and it was all of that and more. And I think that I came to understand his role. I came to understand this country a little more all of that through being able to have the wonderful opportunity. I feel lucky to have had it to engage with, report, and write this book.
Mm. Well, you wrote a wonderful one, and you wrote the equivalent of hitting one out of the park, Kostya. So thank you for taking the time to join us. Everyone, thank you for joining us. Please get the book, True: The Four Seasons of Jackie Robinson. It really is a wonderful book, not just a sports book, but a book about life. So thank you, everyone, and good night.